Hello, everyone. In this second video, I would like to return to our discussion about migration. So basically, we were talking about the different elements about how the development in the global economy was having an effect on Latin America, and we were exploring the last mechanism. So we talked before about international trade, foreign investment, and a last point to consider is migration. So we were discussing essentially the wage gap between uh, some Latin American countries and an average for three countries in the south of Europe that accounted for a substantial share of these migrants coming to Latin America. So, as we mentioned it before, so we have that on average, Argentinian wage were higher than those wage in or the average for these three countries in Southern Europe. That was also the case for Uruguay, for Mexico, and for Cuba. For Mexico, it was mainly in the late 19th, early 20th century that even that the gap was lower than that for Argentina and Uruguay. So still, the average wages were higher in Mexico relative to these three countries in Southern Europe. We can also see the same information, but in a continuous way. So basically, we can see the yearly evolution here, and essentially what we have is that wage were again so we're higher in these three countries in Argentina, Uruguay, and Cuba. So we have a decline here probably as a result of the First World War. So we have a post-war depression. So probably what was going on here is that there is a decline in commodity prices in international market that have a negative impact on Latin America, and that is probably explaining this important but temporary decline in relative wage between Latin America and the three mentioned countries in the south of Europe. There are two additional points to consider in this discussion about migration during the export-led growth period. And the first of these two last points is the fact that even that we have focused mainly on explaining this migration coming from Europe, the growth of migrants the growth of migrants was quite heterogeneous. So basically, we have also Asian migration here. Well, the two largest group of immigrants coming from Asia are first the group of a population coming from the Middle East. We have a large inflow of Lebanese and Syrian migrants, for instance, in the case of Colombia. So probably the largest group of migrants during the early 20th century in Colombia is by far this population coming from the Middle East. Also, we have population coming from East Asia, mainly from China and Japan. We have some example of industrial workers. So we have case of workers that came under that condition, for instance, to building railroads, to building infrastructure, some infrastructure projects, also to work on the mining sector. Also, we have the case of the Japanese migration in Brazil. So this is one of the largest Japanese migration across the world. So in the case of Brazil is that a group of migrants is particularly large. And also we have the case of the role of played the the Chinese workers during the construction of the Panama Canal. Finally, about migration, so we have mentioned the impact of international migration. We associate this with an increase in labor. Labor is one of the two inputs that we usually consider in a production function. So if we are having an increase in the labor force, so we can assume that have a positive impact on 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 the output on this economy's growth potential. But also it's important to consider internal migration. So what we have is that we have relocation of population from areas with high density, with high population density toward these areas with low population density. So that was the case, for instance, in the south of the continent of the movement of people from, for instance, for Buenos Aires area toward the south of the continent. So the increase of the population in Patagonia. Something similar occurred in the case of Chile. So we have is the movement of population toward these areas scarcely populated. In the case of Colombia, we have an important movement of people toward the west of the country. That was the area of the country more connected with international trade because it was the core of the coffee. It was the coffee growing area. So we have this internal relocation. So in the case of Colombia, so we usually call this process of movement of people from the east of the country toward the west of the country, like Antioqueño colonization, basically because Antioquia was it will become the core of the coffee industry. Also, we have the case of the movement of population in the case of Mexico and Chile. In the case of Chile, so basically what we have is people moving from the south toward the north, toward in the mining sector. Okay, so we mentioned it, or we discussed the role of or the different challenges about how the first wave of globalization could have an impact on Latin American economies in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, probably something more fundamental changed in the region. So we have described the proximate cause of economic growth, and now I think that it would be important to explore the ulterior reasons behind economic growth. And these ulterior reasons are, of course, associated with institutions. So what we have is an important but limited institutional progress in the case of Latin America. Again, so I think that what is going here is beyond globalization, and so it's beyond an increase in the demand for commodities. It's also changing the capacity of these economies to display persistent economic growth. And I think that at the core of that institutional progress, what we have is a higher level of institutional quality. Basically, I mentioned that we have a higher level of political centralization. We have higher political stability. That means a substantial reduction in civil wars, in conflicts, and basically we are in a more stable environment in the second half of the 19th century. That is associated with the consolidation of the nation building process in this country, basically. But we can, again, oversimplifying, assume is that the nation building process was ended in Latin America in the second half of the 19th century. We will see, for instance, that expressed in the consolidation of constitutions in different countries. So we have that, for instance, in the case of Argentina, we have the constitution from 1853 that is still in force with different reforms, but it's still the same constitution in Argentina. In the case of Brazil, we have a constitution from 1891. In the case of Chile, so Chile, it was probably the first country in Latin America to achieve the minimum level of stability to be classed like a conclusion or a, a process that consolidated his his nation building. So basically, what we have is that Chile was probably the first country in centralize his political power. So that is probably associated with the fact that his constitution is probably the oldest one among the countries that we are um, seeing here. So the Chilean constitution, the Chilean constitution from 1833 was enforced up to the 1925. So it was a constitution that lasted for almost a century. So it seems like that could provide a minimum of political stability. That is probably associated with the consolidation of or the centralization of political power. We have the case of Colombia. In Colombia, we have a constitution from the 1863. That constitution didn't last for too long. We have a new constitution in the late 19th century, specifically in 1886. But what we can, I mean, again, oversimplifying is that countries are moving to a more centralized political environment than the political disorder that characterized Latin America in the decades after independence. So we have an increase in state capacity. That increase in state capacity means also an increase in taxation, in government's ability to collect taxes. So we can assume that in that sense, so we have an institutional progress, but that progress was limited, was constrained. Is basically what we can probably assume here by a lot of check and balance. So basically what we have is an institutional progress in terms of political centralization, but what is missing here is the improvement in check and balance, and we can see that we have not very much of progress in terms of constraints on the executive power. So we will see that in 1 second. So how can we measure political stability? So that is not a trivial question. So it's not easy. So I mean, the idea, the concept is easy to describe, and it's probably difficult to measure. So we have no a direct way to measure political stability. So I propose this indicator that essentially that comes from a book that I wrote. I think that was 2-3 years ago. That essentially what we are seeing here is the evolution of the sovereign bond yields. Basically, what we see here is what we can describe today like the risk premium or the spread in terms of how much a given country need to pay in order to have access to international capital markets relative to to the rest of the world. So basically, we can associate that the higher the yield, the higher the level of instability, the lower the yield, the higher the level of stability. Basically, what we want here is to have a reduction in the sovereign yield, in the sovereign bond yield, because that means that probably governments are repaying their external debt. Basically, what the the reduction in the yield is associated with an increase in bonds prices, and that means that if bonds are being traded at a good price, so that means that the quality of that debt is good, is positive. So there is a valuation of the market that is considered here. And what we can infer here is that Chile is the first country in experiencing a substantial reduction in his sovereign bond yield. So that means that probably Chile was the first country in resuming his repayment in his external debt. So basically, this is the strong decline that we are observing here. And what I think that is probably the reason is because you have a higher level of political stability, so you have a higher level of centralization of power in the case of Chile. That means that you are having an increase in state capacity. So the Chilean government have a higher ability to collect taxes, and that means that have a higher ability to repay its external debt. Something similar, but later is happening in the case of Argentina. So in the case of Argentina, at some point in the 1850s, we see a similar decline. So basically, once this yield is below, say, 8%, 7%, so we can basically assume that countries reach that minimum of political stability. So that happened first in Chile, later in Argentina, at the almost at the end of the 19th century in Mexico, and in the case of Colombia, so that just happened in the early 20th century. So what we will see is that in the case of Colombia, all the process of centralization of political power um, occurred very, very late relative to the rest of Latin America. And that would be the reason behind this delay in the reduction of the sovereign bond yield. So just to summarize, so this is, I am assuming that this is a proxy for measuring political stability. The idea is that a low yield being that governments are repaying their external debt, and we are assuming that they are repaying their external debt because they have the ability to collect taxes, so they have higher state capacity. That means that probably before that you have some degree of centralization of power. This is a figure that displays the year in which country have been on default in its external debt. So basically what we have here is that and this figure is for the period between 1825 and 1940. So what we have is that in this uh, is long century, so basically in this a little bit more of 100 years, what we have is that Argentina remaining on default almost or around 28% of the time of the year. So we have that essentially in the early 19th century, Argentina was not able to repay his external debt. So we mentioned it, or we discussed the previous week how almost all Latin American countries went into default after the 1825 panic in London, how that was a constraint to access to international capital markets. And in the case of Argentina, so that country was able to resume his payment to his external debt in the mid 19th century. And that resumption in payments is associated with that reduction in his sovereign bond yield. In the case of Chile, so Chile started earlier, so started to repay its external debt, and we can see that that is associated with a reduction um, in his sovereign bond yield, that we can measure this as well by the price of his sovereign bond. So um, the basically the yield is the opposite to the price. So the yield is a ratio where we have the interest rate relative to the price. So an increase in the yield essentially is a decline in a sovereign bond price. In the case of Colombia, so what we have that unfortunately Colombia remaining on default for during most of the 19th century. So it was only in the early 20th century that Colombia was able to resume in a persistent way his repayment to his external debt. We can see that during this period, almost the half of the time Colombia is on default, and after the early 20th century, when Colombia reached that minimum of political stability, is that we will start to see um, capital inflows, railroad construction, integration into the world capital market, and also the rise of the exporting sector and the rise of commodities export. Essentially, in the case of Colombia, we are talking about coffee, of course. In the case of Venezuela, again, so we are talking about a country that stayed on default for a long period. Um, that that I mean, this default from the late 19th century is probably one of the reasons behind Venezuela divergence in regional terms. At the beginning of the lectures, we were comparing Venezuela with Argentina and Chile, and we mentioned that at some point in the late 19th century, um, um, Venezuela diverged from these countries in terms of economic growth. This is what I mentioned some minutes ago, that we have an improvement in institutional terms, but also that improvement was limited by the fact that we have not the same progress in terms of constraints to the executive power, or in other words, so we have not an improvement in terms of check and balance in these countries. What we have here is a very popular indicator known as Polity 5. That is basically an score between 1 and 7 that is basically trying to measure the constraints to the executive power. Usually we associate this to the relative power of the other branch of government, basically the parliament, or the of the parliament relative power. And what we can see here is that improvement in that area was quite limited. So we have some improvement in the case of Argentina. So this is probably the due to the 1853 constitution. So we have an improvement in the constraint on executive power. But once we have this initial improvement, that indicator remained with that score for the remaining of the period. So we are talking about a very limited democracy, because even that we have elections, even that we have a different presidents, so we have no a proper dictatorship here. So the relative power between the executive and the parliament uh, was uh, was very concentrated in favor of the first, in favor of the executive. Something similar happened in the case of Brazil. So in the case of Brazil, this improvement is associated with the end of monarchy. So basically with the first or the transition toward the Brazilian Republic. But again, so once we have this initial improvement, so Brazil remained with this score for the remaining of the period. So again, so we have some democracy, but a very limited democracy. So that would be a good way to describe what is going on here. The only country uh, where we have a persistent increase in this indicator is Chile. So what is going on in the case of Chile is that in the late 19th century, there is a war, a civil war. Basically, what we have is a conflict between the parliament and the president, and the parliament won that war, and that was the beginning of the so-called the parliamentary era in the case of Chile. So basically, the ruling institution in the case of Chile was the parliament rather than the president, and that political model was enforced until the um, the late 1920s. In the case of Colombia, what we have is an increase in this indicator during the federalist period, but we will see that in 1 second. So that political system didn't last for too long. We have another civil war in the 1880 in the 1880s. That means a deterioration of this indicator and an increase in the executive relative power. So we will see that in 1 second. In the case of Colombia, we have a further deterioration after another civil war, so the so-called the 1,000 Days War by the turn of the century. Basically, what we have is a transition toward essentially autocracy in the early 20th century. So what we have is not properly an autocracy because we still have election, but we have a hyper concentration of political power in the hands um, of the executive or the president. So yeah, I think that an autocracy will be a good description. So basically, what we have here is in the a political system where we have some democracy, but without the right check and balance. We have the same indicator for other four countries. You can see that Mexico is with the lowest score here with this indicator. So this is basically in the case of the late 19th century. So this is the so-called Porfiriato, the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship. That basically, again, what we have is a hyper concentration of political power just in the hands of the executive. Something similar in the case of Venezuela with an improvement in the late 19th century, but that improvement didn't last for too long. So in the case of Venezuela is uh, unto a certain extent similar to that of Colombia. So um, an improvement at some point during this period, but an improvement that didn't persist for too long. Okay, so now let's examine some of the political regimes that consolidated during this period. This is just a picture of the Argentinian Constitution of the 1853. And after a reform of that constitution, basically what we have is a reform that um, reinforced the reform that was implemented in the 1860. Basically, what did is that reinforced the role of Buenos Aires in the Argentina Republic. After that, point that we associate with consolidation of political power, we will see the rise of the so-called the historical administration. So in Spanish, would be las presidencias históricas. That is basically covered three presidents. The three presidents that we see here are Mitre, Sarmiento, and Avellaneda. So these three administrations that have several points in common. Basically, they are like basically they eh, they are associated with the consolidation of the new political regime that started with the new constitution. So basically, what we have here is a new constitution from the mid-19th century that was reformed by Mitre, and after that, so we will have a continuity. And again, so what we have here is an increase in political stability in the sense that we have a centralization of power. So what we have here is a substantial reduction in civil wars, in conflicts, but the missing point here again is the constraints on the executive power. So that movement toward political centralization or the centralization of political powers, I think that would be a better description. So was continued for the so-called degeneration of the 1880s. This basically the the political system that ruled Argentina in the late 19th, early 20th century. So what we have during the so-called Argentinian Belle Époque is an increase in state capacity, but with few constraints on the executive power. So now let's see the case of Chile. So we mentioned it. So in the case of Chile, so it's interesting that it would be the first country in Latin America in achieve that minimum of political stability to make economic growth feasible. We associate that minimum of political stability with this constitution from the early 19th century. As I mentioned before, Chile would be an outlier in Latin America in the sense that we will see an improvement not just in political centralization that occurred very early in the 19th century, but also in constraints to the executive power. And that substantial increase that we see here is associated with this civil war between in the 1891 between the parliament and the president. President Balmaceda was the president during this civil war. The most relevant battle from that civil war is the Battle of Concon. This is the pain that we can see here. And after the war, so you can infer, so the parliament won this civil war. So that was the beginning of the so-called the parliamentary era. So this is a picture of the former Congress building that is so representative of the parliamentary era that lasted up to the mid 1920s. The case of Colombia is more complex than that of Argentina and Chile. In the case of Colombia, what we will see is a delay in the centralization of political power. So we will see that these problems associated with the consolidation of the state, with the whole nation building process was more complicated in the case of Colombia. So that is what I want to say. So again, we can associate this with the evolution of this indicator. So we mentioned it before that the lower this indicator is, the higher the level of political stability. So we mentioned that in the case of Chile, so that occurred very early in the 19th century, and in the case of Colombia, that happened just in the 20th century. So we wanted to know why why that took I mean, why that took more time in Colombia to achieve the same level of political stability. And what we have in Colombia is that the conflict between the two main political parties, the liberals and the conservatives, was prolonged in the second half of the 19th century. So we have that this constitution, the constitution for the federal period, I mean the constitution from the 1863 was um, associated with one of the political parties, the Liberal Party. So usually in the Colombian historiography, we call this period the Federal Liberal era because the hegemonic party was the Liberal Party, and because one of the main points on the Liberal Party's agenda was a high degree of decentralization, or a federal political system. We have here the two of the most important characters from that period. I mean, two presidents, Manuel Murillo Toro and President Aquilio Parra. These this president, the second one, was also a Ministry of Finance during several administrations during the liberal period. So they were two very influential characters during this period. And what happened in the case of Colombia is that a political system collapsed at some point in the late 19th century, specifically in the 1880s. So we will see the rise of another political regime, uh, very on an ultra conservative political regime, known in Colombia la Regeneración. That was the name of this um, um, historical period that basically went between the 1880s up to the end of the century. And we have here the probably the two most influential characters, or by far the two most influential presidents for this period, President Rafael Núñez and Miguel Antonio Caro. Caro was the vice president during the last Núñez administration. But basically, like we have this prolongation in the conflict between liberals and conservative. So what we have is that Colombia was not able to achieve this minimal level of political stability, like was the case of Argentina and Chile. Basically, what we have is that the the second half of the 19th century, in the case of Colombia, is not very different from the first half of the 19th century. So basically, what we have is um, a prolongation of the political disorder that characterized the the decades after the independence in the Latin America. So in the case of Colombia, we have a prolongation of that until the end of the 19th century. We have traditional country. Oh, if you wanted to know the details about Colombia, essentially how Colombia missed this, how Colombia missed this period of or the first wave of globalization. So I recommend my books that, I mean, basically I tried to make a description of the Colombia economic growth patterns for the last 2 centuries. But I think that at least for the export growth period, for the first wave of globalization. So you have a summary here about the political economy and the conflict between liberal and conservative, and how that have an impact on the government stability. Okay, so now let's review two additional countries. I think that that would be the last part of the lecture. So, in the case of Mexico, the political regime that consolidated in the late 19th century was the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship. So, what we have again, so is the same pattern. So, an increase in state capacity associated with a centralization of political power, but a very poor institutional improvement in terms of democracy or in terms of check and balance between the parliament and the executive power. This is a picture of Porfirio Diaz. And in the particular case of Mexico, we will have that like the political power was very concentrated in the executive. So what we have is that there was a small group of what we call today the like the technocrats. In that period, they people call them like the scientists or los científicos in Spanish. They were essentially the small group of um, um, uh, lawyers, economists, administrators that essentially ruled the country. So most known of them is this guy on the right, Liban Tours. He was the Ministry of Finance. Um, he was a very important character during the Porfiriato era. And finally, we have the case of Brazil. So in the case of Brazil, what we have is in the late 19th century is a transition from monarchy toward a republic. So as we discussed it as we discussed it last week. So in the case of Brazil, you have no the process of independence is very different from the rest of Latin America, and what we have is a monarchy during most of the 19th century. After Peter II, I think he was the last emperor of Brazil. What we have in the case of Brazil is a movement toward a republic. So this is what we see here. So that improvement in terms of democracy or constraints to executive power. Something interesting that occurred in Brazil is that Brazil behaved very well during in terms um, of repay his external debt during the early 19th century and during most of 19th century. But we will see that during this political transition, for a reasons of Brazil went into default. And that probably have an impact in the fact that reduced Brazil's ability to attract capital inflows in the core of the third wave of globalization. So something interesting about this is that it's not only important for a country to repay his external debt in order to have access to foreign investment, but also timing is important. So basically, we can contrast the case of Argentina and Brazil. So Argentina defaulted during the early 19th century, but because the first wave of globalization, and again, so the rise of foreign investment occurred in the late 19th century, so that default didn't have a persistent impact in Argentina's ability to attract capital inflows. So what we have in Brazil is that Brazil behaved very well, but went into default at the wrong time. So basically, at the time when the window of opportunity to receive capital inflow was open in the context of the first wave of globalization. I think that would be all in this lecture. I think that we have an additional slide that is just a picture of the Constitution in the case of Brazil from the Constitution of 1891. I think that would be all in this lecture. I'm gonna stop to share my screen. And thank you very much, and see you next week to talk about the 20th century and the inward-looking industrialization.